Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Surviving Out of Spite. I'm your host, Samantha Sauer, and today we have an incredibly special guest in the studio. For those of us that have been in the space for a while, you definitely have her cookbook. For those of you who are new to the space, I am so excited to introduce her to you. Crystal Saltrelli is here today to have some different conversations around gastroparesis and chronic illness. Conversations that we don't generally have when it comes to dealing with your diagnosis. And she really gave me a lot to think about. So I am so excited to have you all listen, and I will let her introduce herself. So, hi, Crystal. Thank you for being with us today. I want to give you a little bit of a chance to introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about your story for the people who are new to the gastroparesis space, even though I know you've probably told your story 8 billion times. If you can give us the Reader's Digest version for those that haven't heard it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. My name is Crystal. I was diagnosed with idiopathic gastroparesis in 2004. So it's been over 2 decades now, and it's been quite a ride. I was 23 years old at the time, so I have lived the vast majority of my adult life with gastroparesis. I have a little bit, I think, of a unique perspective because about 5 years in after I was diagnosed, I went back to school, became a health coach, and in the last 15 years I have been able to work with and talk to and hear from literally like thousands of people with gastroparesis around the world. And so it's been a really interesting mix of navigating that from a personal perspective and helping other people navigate that. I have gone, I think we'll talk about this today, but kind of my transition has gone from living with gastroparesis to living well with gastroparesis to kind of living with gastroparesis, from a personal perspective, like pretty much in the background of my life. I have, from an objective standpoint, my gastric emptying has really run the gamut over those 20 years, from severely delayed to completely normal. And so there's a lot of variability and a lot of stuff I think we can talk about, and I'm happy to kind of go wherever this goes.
Well, I know that when you came to the conference, or virtually, I should say, came to the conference, for me, it was a little bit of a, kind of a full circle moment, because when I got first diagnosed, when you type in gastroparesis into Google, right? We got G-PACT and I got you. So it was really cool for me, to be in a space where I'm I know her. She's coming here. I get to have a conversation with her. And all the things that, I learned from you back in the beginning when I was new, and I'm I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. And my mom bought your cookbook, and, we've used some recipes out of it, and it was just really helpful from a newbie perspective way back then for me to really see somebody living with it. Like you said, living well with gastroparesis. I know that everyone's stories are different and things are possible for some that might not be for others. And I always try to take that into account, but to really be able to see that for somebody, it is possible, without being mushy and saying it's inspirational, it is, because it shows you that it can be done. And you've been so open about how you did it and what your roadblocks were and that path that you chose to be able to be in the driver's seat now and have a little bit more control of the crazy car, with all the parts are staying in your car where, but you've had other days where the wheels fell off. So it's just really nice to be able to see that start to finish, and you've been open about that journey, and just it's from a patient perspective and the community perspective, we really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's so important. It's funny because I was actually I'm working on a rewrite of my first book, Living Well with Gastroparesis. It was published in 2011. She's like an oldie now and needs a little updating, so I've been working on that. And in doing so, I've been looking at a lot of the newer research that's coming out around gastroparesis in the last, few years, things that have been published in 2024, 2025. And there is a significant amount of research now looking at gastroparesis as a disorder of the brain-gut axis, which I think most of us, it's not surprising, right?
Yeah.
But in that, the brain then is an integral part of this condition. And we tend to focus all of our treatment on the gut. And then we're finding that it's really hard to manage, and it seems like there's missing pieces here. And there are. And the research is really finding that the way people think about the condition influences their quality of life, their perception of their symptoms,
Makes a lot of sense.
And not just from like, oh, I think it's worse, so it's worse, but the brain is a key part of this. And so what the brain is doing is influencing what the gut is doing and vice versa. And so, I think it goes beyond, inspiration, and I think that's important. But I think, this is a very real and important and emerging part of living with gastroparesis and managing gastroparesis, to examine the way we talk about gastroparesis, the way we conceptualize gastroparesis, the way we relate to it, because that matters for symptom management as much as what we're eating, the medicines we're taking.
It's such a turning point to talk about that, because you're right. Like, it's not trying to focus on like toxic positivity and like, I can do this even though like something's falling apart. And it's not the idea that you are ignoring those things, or that you're not acknowledging that like this is a horrible situation or this is a difficult situation, however you want to look at that. It's more just teaching ourselves how to manage that, but we're not managing our nausea. We're managing like that self-talk, that negative self-talk, kind of how you look at that with yourself. You're not going to feel good if you already told yourself you feel bad, right? It's like, it's setting us up for failure because we're missing, like you said, this key part in how to manage that. And if we don't have somebody to teach you that, you don't know what you don't know, right? So how are we supposed to get better at doing something that we didn't even know was breaking down the process or making a lot of our struggles maybe more difficult?
Yeah, or that we didn't even realize was a factor or was happening. I think we're not used to looking at our thinking as anything other than truth and factual, right?
Yeah.
And our brain is making up, I think they call it like the common sense model of medicine or something. They use it with like IBS and these kinds of things, but it's basically the perception that your brain makes up of the condition that you have based on your experience, right, with your symptoms, what you've heard from your doctors, what you've seen from, online, and kind of the brain makes up kind of this container of this is what it means to have this condition. And it's super difficult to live from a place outside of that container, right? Because it doesn't even cross your brain as a possibility. And I think for me, when I talk about, I was living with gastroparesis and I was living well with gastroparesis, those shifts or, that transition, I think for me always came from a place of seeing a new possibility where my brain went, oh, maybe there's something else possible here. Because when I was diagnosed in 2004, there was not a lot out there. Actually, Carissa's blog, which ended up becoming G-PACT, was pretty much the only thing I could find. But what there was a lot of really scary stuff, because at that point it was really hard to be on like message boards, and it wasn't like it is now where everyone has a phone and the and so the people who were going through that effort to do that were the people who were really, really struggling and really in need of help. And so as skewed as the picture is now, which I still think it is on social media, it was 100%. Really skewed then. And so it didn't look possible to me to do anything other than survive at that point. And then I went back to school for health coaching, and I started to see, wait, there are a lot of things I'm not doing, like we're not doing as a community in terms of, this holistic, what I ended up calling a comprehensive management plan. And I started to think, well, maybe I can feel better. And so then that possibility kind of opens you up to like, maybe I can live well. And then, I was struggling with really bad postpartum anxiety after I had my daughter, and I started seeing a coach for that. And she was talking basically about this stuff, but like related to anxiety, right? Like how we perceive things is how we feel things. Like everything is filtered through that. And it really allowed me to see gastroparesis through a different lens. And that totally changed my experience. And so that's why I think these kinds of conversations are so important, because we think a lot of this is like willful. Like I just need to try harder. I need to think better. I need, all these kinds of things. And I think, so much of it just comes down to whatever that little opening is in your brain that kind of lets it say, like, wait a minute, maybe there's more to this story.
Yeah. It's so interesting to look at it that way. And I know that that's something I'm still working on. Like, I know that I was trying to think, I think it's been over 10 years at this point that I was diagnosed. And I'm like, thinking back to where I was and what you're talking about, within probably the first 6 months or so, like, I thought I was going to need TPN to survive, which it turned out that I did need TPN at some point. But initially, talking about being skewed, like, I thought that's just what you were treated with, or that you automatically needed a feeding tube, because the people who are living well are no longer on the message boards. They're not in the support groups. So the people that are left are sometimes left with like this nightmarish situation, and your doctors don't always give you the best perception of what things are going to be, or are willing to have that hard truth conversation with you to say that this is where it could be, this is what we can do for you. I mean, if you're not doing exactly what they're telling you to do, sometimes you're labeled as non-compliant, but you're not trying to be non-compliant. You're just trying to find a different route to feeling better. And depending on how you verbalize that, depending on, honestly, the day that the doctor is having when you're trying to verbalize that, is going to determine how that communication goes over. And it's really true, at least from my perspective too, that there's a place for that real holistic type of treatment along with the more medicinal, like Western medicine type of treatment. Like, I was septic. You can't think that away. You know, good thoughts, you know, having a good attitude, that's not going to make the infection disappear, right? But my will to survive in that situation helped my body. It told my body, it told like every cell, everything in me, like, this is not it. This is not what we're doing. And I think that helped me. So just even from my perspective of how could these two things kind of work well together, that's my best example, right, of how trying to take on a lot of the mentality that you're talking about, how that really helped me. And I think it could help a lot more people, but it gets mixed into that toxic positivity mindset, and even that gets skewed. You know, it's like, we're not trying to tell you, like, smile and say everything's okay. We're trying to teach you how to work within what you have, you know, how to live with it, not live against it, not fight against it, not say that it's necessarily okay, but just to kind of live in a neutral environment to the best of your ability with the disease that you really can't get rid of. You can just manage it, but this isn't a typical way that we're taught how to manage the disease. It's, here's a treatment that probably won't work. Here's a drug that'll give you some extra side effects. If those don't work, which they probably won't, we'll probably have to cut you open.
Yeah. And I think the big distinguisher, you know, for me between the positive thinking and, you know, just know that everything's going to be okay, and that's still made up stories, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, whether you're thinking like, I'm absolutely going to need a feeding tube, or I'm definitely going to be cured, you know, in XYZ months. Either way, those are still made up stories. And so for me, it really comes back to like, what's true now? What's real now? Because even as you were talking about with, you know, needing TPN, and I think education goes a long way for people. I mean, according to the research that I've read, it's less than 5% of people who need artificial nutrition who are diagnosed with gastroparesis. But I would say nearly 100% of people that I've talked to are terrified of that. And so, you know, it's all the time you spend like, what if I need a feeding tube? I don't want a feeding tube. First of all, that's not going to affect the vast majority of people. Secondly, I think you can tell me, but from the people I've talked to, I have not had that. I've had gastric nerve stimulator and other things. But from the people I've worked with, the fear leading up to it and around it and the what ifs is much more suffering than when 100%. It comes, right? When that comes and it's like, oh, okay, this is the next right step. This is the next thing that I need to do. And you do it. And so for me, it's not even about like positive, negative. It's about seeing like what's a story that, you know, my brain has made up around this because of what I've seen, what I've told, what I've experienced in the past. You know, brains are constantly projecting versus what is true right now. Right now, I'm okay. Yeah. Right now I'm here standing here talking to you, and that's not positivity. That's not anything other than being present with what is. And then you do that again in the next moment, and you do that again in the next moment.
Yeah. And you know, it's funny when you break it down like that, it sounds so simple, right? To just kind of stay there. And we know that it's not that simple. And even thinking back with like feeding tubes, so many people, and you hear the fear of, I got a feeding tube or I need a feeding tube, my whole life is over. Like, this is it. It's the end of it. And from somebody who's had both a feeding tube and been on TPN, I've been septic multiple times. I've had multiple infections. I've been in situations where needing those things also caused some bad things. Good things, bad things. It happens. But the fear, like you said, around that was so much higher. And I think that when I got my feeding tube and after that, I'm like, it gave me my life back. Like, all of that fear, like, yes, there is a fear around sepsis. I will never say there isn't. Like, you should always be on high alert if you have a central line, right? Like, that doesn't disappear. That fear isn't disappearing. But if that's keeping you from being able to do anything else, or holding you back from being able to function, that's a problem. That's not good. That's not good to have. You can't live in that fear, because if your body's living and you're feeling that fear 24/7 and you're in fight or flight mode, there's no space for healing whatsoever. None. And I know that from my own experience.
Yeah.
But I wanted to touch on something that we had talked about the other day, where you had said in kind of changing your mindset and working around your mindset with curiosity and like looking at things through a curiosity lens. And as I mentioned to you before we hopped on this, that really kind of stuck with me. And if you don't mind sharing a little more about that with everybody else, hopefully it'll stick in somebody else's head, because it was very, very helpful for me to hear that, you know, from somebody who is using this to feel better, to, you know, strengthen your brain muscle and not just treating everything else.
Yeah, and it goes nicely with what we were just talking about, right? With kind of being in the present moment, because our brains are almost always telling stories about the past and the future. And most of the time, we just take those as fact, right? This happened, this is going to happen. And what I found is the more curious we can be about those things, especially the things that look really true, the more it opens up space for us to see things differently, experience these kinds of shifts that you and I are talking about. But it can be difficult because a lot of these things look really true to us. I think you and I were talking about this around the idea that so many of us feel like we've lost a version of ourselves, right?
Yes.
Or we want to get back to how we used to be. And I think that's such a common experience, but also if you start to get really curious about that, it's interesting because, you know, you can ask yourself questions like, where is that me? Like, where are they? They do not exist is really, that's the only answer I can come up with. I mean, I love these kinds of conversations because it's a do-it-yourself kind of thing, right? Like, don't take my word for it. Don't take our word for it. Really do this. And I think the doing of this is where things shift. You can listen to people, and sometimes you can listen and get an insight and things will shift. But if you really start to get curious about these things that look really true, the things that feel really painful, right? Because I think we often think that it feels painful because it's true. Mm-hmm. But what I find so often is it feels painful because it's not true. You know, the feeling of my life is over. Yeah. That's super painful. And as I said, I've worked with thousands of people in the last 15 years. What people think is going to happen never happens, you know, and this idea that is so common, and it's not a problem, right? A brain will say, well, my life is over. Everything's different. Brain hates that, right? It'll throw a fit. That'll feel really bad. That's not your signal to take it seriously and dig in. That's your signal to get really curious. Why does it feel that way? What does that mean to me? How could that be true? Am I here right now? What's true? I love the question, what's real right now?
Yeah.
Because I've been using that a lot lately, because it immediately, if I have to ask myself what's real right now, it's almost never anything that's been going through my head for the last 25 minutes. Right?
It's a grounding moment. Like
Yeah.
I feel like in the midst of, if I could remember this, in the midst of like real heavy anxiety, a moment where like I can't calm my brain down. I do have like my poor husband has to handle my coping skills, because for me, talking about it is my way of getting it out of me, so I can let it go once I get it out, right? But I think that you can't always do that. If you need a sounding board, you don't always have a sounding board, so that's not always going to work, right? But I feel like in a moment, if you could really sit there and say, what's real right now, even just asking yourself that question almost like pulls you right back in to be like, what?
Yeah.
And then it kind of gets you thinking. It's like it burns a new pathway of thinking about something where you were going off over here. And I know I do it. I deal with a lot of anxiety. I did before I got sick, and it's only gotten worse since I've gotten sick. And I think about that, and I now am going to really try to use that, because just as you're talking, I'm like, what is real right now? Like, I'm listening to you, but also in the back of my head, I'm like, what? So to really have that conversation with yourself, it feels like such a grounding moment, and it's so simple, but so powerful. But getting ourselves to do the thing is also the difficult piece of that. But, you know, like I said, you stuck with me the other day when you were talking about this, so I really can't thank you enough for that, because now I have this other tool in my head that will pull me back to say, what is true right now? Why am I so focused on something? Where is she? What is this? What am I thinking? What is real in this moment? And it's true that when you ask yourself what is real, it might be a really scary moment. You might be in something where no wonder you're in fight or flight mode. But that also might help you figure out, like, which direction do I need to go into? Like, where is my safety from here? Whether it's mental or physical safety too. So it's just such a huge thing to really think about. That's so simple.
It is. It's really practical in that way, because it's really hard to see a way forward when you're caught in your head and like running through all of these possible scenarios and everything I've heard and everything I'm worried about. And, you know, we are equipped, I think, to move forward moment by moment. I don't know if I talked about this in the talk I gave for G-PACT for your conference, but I always think of Frozen 2, because I have a daughter who is of the age that Frozen and Frozen 2 were like huge in our house for a long time. And there's a part in Frozen 2 where Anna is in a really devastating position, you know, like, spoiler alert, she thinks, you know, everybody has died. And she feels very alone. And it is that moment's very super heavy. But what she comes to is, I need to do the next right thing, and the next right thing. And there's this whole song, it's a beautiful song about just do the next right thing. And I think we do that next right thing, like, from that place of presence. That's how we just do the next thing, you know? And we think we do the next thing because we've done all these calculations in our brain and we've rate, you know, the pros and the cons. But I really don't see that anymore. I mean, I really feel like we do the next right thing, and then our brain will make up a reason of like why we did that. But we don't need all of that noise. We don't need to sit in that kind of storm of thinking to do that, to just move forward. And like you said, there are situations where something really serious is going on. But from a present state of mind, like, you are a human being with a survival instinct. You're not going to do nothing when you need to do something from that, like, present place.
Yeah. It's such a mindset shift, truly. And I think that, again, and I know, like, we can say it 1,000 times, but I do think it's something that we really need to keep saying, is that these conversations don't happen enough. And I hate that, because this is something, and not just to say like we're having this very special conversation that no one else is having. It's not that. It's all the pieces that go around dealing with chronic illness in itself. You know, it doesn't matter what disease state you have, whether it's gastroparesis, lupus, or EDS. There's all of these different disease states. This can be applied to every single thing. And frankly, even if you don't have any, chronic illness issues, you can still apply all of this mindset work to your life, because anxiety doesn't just come to people who have diseases. It's not just something that we deal with. Stressors aren't exclusive to the chronic illness community, but that grounding mindset, that mindset of trying to be present and learn to essentially live with yourself and to live well with yourself, that we really need to adopt more of, but especially in our communities where there's such a focus on the scary. And I get it, I totally understand it. I'm not shitting on it. I've been in there. There's a focus on the other side of it of, there's no cure. This is my life now. There's like all of these things that are inherently negative. But like you said, if you're not necessarily focusing on it as like, here's a positive and here's a negative, and we have to kind of choose, like, two things can be true. You can have both of those things. You don't have to choose one side or the other. You don't have to feel this or feel this. You don't have to focus on this or this. I think the practice of really trying to center yourself and say, I don't have to choose this emotion or this feeling or this space. You don't have to pick something. We're dynamic, emotional individuals. We don't need to focus on one. But I think we're taught that, like, if you're a happy person, you don't get to be sad, right? If you're a sad person or you're dealing with severe depression, if you have a couple happy days, it means you're not depressed anymore. It's like you have to choose a side, and to not have to choose a side feels wrong. It feels completely wrong to say, I'm living in these dynamic emotions and I'm just trying to survive in the midst of it in the best way that I know how, or in the healthiest way I know how. And again, as you start recognizing these patterns, as you start talking about these things, you start to realize that there's, I think, a lot more that you can do, and like a lot of other parts of your brain, other things that you can talk about, to feel, to do, that open up once you kind of sit back and you're like, oh, okay. At least I can say that happened for me. And it's not perfect at all. Like, I'm still working on this. I'm still dealing with a lot of things in my head where I have to pull myself back to say, we're not doing that anymore. Like, that we don't like this anymore. This is uncomfortable. But when you've gone down that same pathway over and over and over again, instinctually, that's where you're going to go. So as you forge a new one, again, it feels wrong. Feels like you shouldn't be doing that, and you have to actively pull yourself into these new habits, this new mindset, these new grounding techniques until they become that new pathway.
Yeah, I think that's a really great thing to point out. There's discomfort in this a lot of times, and we are so I don't know, I think just naturally wired to avoid discomfort.
It makes sense.
Yeah. That I think there's something really important you said about, I think you said it in terms of depression, right? Like, if you are a, quote, depressed person, you can't be happy. And I think that is something that shows up a lot around chronic illness in general. But I think, obviously we talk about gastroparesis. It feels like your identity becomes this person with gastroparesis, this person with chronic illness, I'm sick. And I think sometimes it feels uncomfortable to not live in that identity.
Yeah.
Because of all other kinds of thinking we have about, well, then people won't believe me, or, just there's a lot, right? I know everybody listening can probably relate to this, but again, that's where curiosity, I think, is so important. Like, would somebody with diabetes never be able to have a good time?
Yeah.
But like that doesn't even make sense, right?
No.
But somehow we make up these stories like, I I can't, I have to show, I think often it feels like I have to show the pain that I feel. So it's real, or it's valid, or, whatever that is. And that's so limiting. I mean, it's so relatable. Like I was there for a long time, but to get curious about those things, like we were talking about, and you don't have to get curious with anybody else, right? Just for yourself. That doesn't have to be any kind of a public thing. Like that's just for you, right? Nobody else has to, go on this exploration, but just to ask yourself, like, why? Is that serving me? Is that making my life easier? Is that alleviating my suffering? Like really to ask yourself these questions around kind of these habitual responses that we have without, I mean, there's no blame, there's no shame, there's nothing. I mean, these are all things that a brain does. It's super impersonal, right? A brain creates identity around things. It doesn't matter if it's, a sports team that you love or a diagnosis that you have, right? That's what brains do. And our agency, I think, is to kind of do those uncomfortable things and ask those questions to ourselves. And really, like, is this helping me? Yeah. And if it's not helping me, do I want to continue to do that? Like, what if I just felt how I felt in any given moment? And sometimes I feel terrible, and sometimes I feel good, or pretty good, or joyful, or hopeful.
I think we had touched on, not today, but in a past conversation about like the seasons of life. And again, I'm like, everything that I'm going to say, I'm like, that stuck with me. So again, thank you. But just myself and thinking back to like, actually it was 2020. So like the beginning of, everything with the COVID years and everything, I was probably at the healthiest that I had been since I got sick at that point. Physically, mentally, that was where I was, at least from my perspective now, I feel like that was where I was my strongest. So as the years kind of went on and things took turns for the worse in one way or the other, or they just changed, and I kept in the back of my head, I'm like, I want to be her again, and you'd see pictures because your body changes, like we don't get a lot of control over how our body changes. So it's like some days you feel good, some days you feel bad. And I kept thinking in the back of my head, like, I just want to get back to her. But you're right that she does not exist anymore. She is a version of me that got me to this version of me. And, going through those seasons of where I'm doing okay, like, you said something about like gastroparesis is kind of like in the background. I've had days like that. I've had months like that because I had a successful G-poem. I've had those days where I can eat within my limits, because I know do not go outside those limits. If you want to keep this normalcy, don't go outside those limits. But where I would feel good. And it's almost like this is the goal, right? Like that's the goal. You want to be the driver. You don't want it to be the driver. But yet, when that happens, at least for me, this weird guilt kind of comes in. And this weird, like, if I start not feeling good, or I go to the doctor and I'm doing okay, are they still going to believe me that I'm sick? Or do I not belong in X community anymore because I'm not as sick as the people in there? So it's like, you don't want to wear your disability or your disease as a badge, but yet it's almost like that's the stamp you need on your hand to get in somewhere, right? Like that's the thing that gets somebody to believe you, is when that disability or that disease, that pain, however you want to look at it, is visible from the outside. Or, just your suffering is available for people to see, where that's not always the case. And I stopped sharing a lot of my journey. I stopped talking about a lot of what I deal with because I was hurt, in the sense that I couldn't go back to where I wanted to be. I didn't have anything positive to share. Like, I didn't have anything negative to share. I was just actually living. I wasn't thriving. I wasn't surviving. I was just like right kind of in the middle. And like, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere anymore, because I wasn't normal, but I wasn't sick enough, but I was like in this weird space. And just trying to think about that now, I'm like, why was that such a hard space to be in. It was almost like I couldn't allow myself to enjoy it because like I run, right? Or at least I used to run a lot more. Someone would see me running and they're like, hey, like I see you running, you must be doing great. And I'm like, no, still sick. Like, why did I have to say that? Why did I have to remind them that like, no, I'm still like, I'm not cured, I'm not better. I mean, but I am better. Like, it's a weird thing to want to celebrate that, but yet feel like you have to say, yes, I'm doing really good, but no, I'm still sick. It's like the world forces you to wear that always, as whether it's a shield, a comfort blanket, however you want to look at that. So somebody, I think it comes down to, believes you and sees you for what that part of you is. Because if it's not at the front and center, if it's not where you're labeled, where do you belong? And it's a weird thing to start to notice that too when you're in that part of your life. If you're not in the scary place, but you're not in the healthy place, where do you go? And you have to sit with that in itself too, of like, why is this a thing? Why can't I enjoy this season of saying, I'm doing okay, I feel healthier, I worked my ass off to get to this place. A little bit of luck, a lot of hard work, right, to get to this place. Why is that so difficult to celebrate? You know, it doesn't make me any less sick. It doesn't make me any less of a patient or any less of an advocate. It doesn't make me any less of anything. But yet I felt that when I was in that space. And it's just a weird thing thinking about the seasons and trying to really say, what about that is true? Or is this a narrative that I'm putting in my own head because maybe somebody else had that narrative, or it's my perception of your perception of my situation, instead of just me saying what is real right now, what is true right now. But the other side of that is, in a world of invisible illnesses, we do essentially have to prove that, to where when you're not believed in certain situations or by certain doctors or certain things, like, you know, that could be detrimental to your health too. So it leaves you in another weird position of like, how do I prove what I know to be true when you can't see it because your perception of me is different? It's just a weird, my brain went off on a weird thing after we talked about that. But it's those things to think about, like, why? Why is it like this?
Yeah, and I love kind of watching you in real time, you know, get curious about all of those things because, you know, I am somebody who, like I said, over the last 20 years, my symptoms have been really severe to virtually non-existent. I have had, you know, a really severe delay in gastric emptying to a gastric emptying test that was cut at 3 hours because everything had already emptied, you know? So, and I have had doctors who have said, you know, everything from come back when you need a feeding tube. That was one of the first doctors, which was great. Nice. To, you know, I really think like you're getting better and this is going away. And so I have been, I think, in those just surviving, the living, the thriving, you know, and I've been in a place where it's, do I even say I have gastroparesis anymore? You know, right now, you know, I do, like, my gastric emptying is delayed and I have all the symptoms. I'm quite confident that, you know, I know what to say now. But I think what I have seen is that when you are feeling good, focusing on the fact that you're still sick doesn't necessarily prevent anybody from not believing you still later, right? Like, all of these things that we do in an effort to achieve a particular outcome down the road.
Yeah.
That's all kind of busy work for the brain, because you're going to show up in that moment and that doctor is going to show up in that moment and you're each going to come to whatever conclusion you come to.
Yeah. It's true.
And so for me, you may have this too. You said you stopped sharing, so I assume you had some of this. But, you know, I had the added layer of people who comment on my YouTube videos and my blog posts. And, you know, people saying, well, you must not, if you can say these things, you must not have gastroparesis.
Yep.
And, you know, that used to really bother me. And it was like, no, I have to prove to you that I'm sick too. Yeah. But it occurred to me that I don't have to do that. I mean, I don't have to prove anything, really. I have my lived experience. I'm talking about what I know personally to be true. And anything beyond that is kind of, more narrative, like you said.
Yeah.
And I know that we're going to show up in whatever moment we show up in, and that doctor's going to believe me or he's not. And if he doesn't, I'm going to do the next thing, which is, find a different doctor, talk to the nurse practitioner, try again. You know what I mean? It's like these ways in which we limit ourselves preemptively to try to prevent something down the road. It doesn't work anyway, and it just makes now harder. Yeah. That's what I've seen to be true. And again, like, I don't want anybody to just take, like, what we're saying is the absolute truth. Like, look at it for yourself. Like, get really super curious about this. Is kind of sitting in but I'm still sick now, is that helping you?
Yeah.
And
no, it's not.
I mean, for me personally, the answer to that is usually no.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, as you're saying, like, you've had like severe delayed emptying and other times where you're like, can I even say that I have this? And I think about that, like, as I'm listening, I'm like, well, I wouldn't say, if she's like, yeah, I can eat normally now, I would never judge her and be like, you're less sick. Why can't I do that for myself? And that's a thing to get curious about. That's a thing to think about. That why is it that your lived experience, that you talking about this, I hear it, I'm listening, I'm like, I'm glad that you got to that spot. That's great for you. I don't think any less of your lived experience with that, but yet with my own, instantly less. Why? So now you've given me something else to think about. So thank you. I'll bring that up in therapy in my next session. Be like, so I had this offshoot therapy session with Crystal Saltrelli, and now I've got all these things to talk about. But it's good though, because it gets you thinking. It gets your brain moving in a different pattern, in a different way. And I'm like, I want to be able to celebrate the wins. I don't want to have to prove anything to anyone. And I think, like you were saying with different comments on blog posts and stuff, when you put yourself out there, and that was something starting the podcast here that I'm like, well, I have to be prepared that someone's not going to like what I say, because I'm not going to be for everyone. And I'm not trying to be for everyone either. But someone out there is going to say, I don't like what you have to say, and I'm going to tell you about it. Or I don't like what you have to say and I'm having a bad day, so now you're going to have a bad day because of what I feel that I need to say to you. And I'm like, let them come. That's not an invitation for people to do anything.
No, but don't open that door.
But, it's one of those things where I have realized working in patient advocacy that sometimes, like, it's that old mentality of hurt people, right? Where somebody shows up and they don't like exactly what you have to say, or their lived experience is so vastly different from your own that it's almost impossible for that person to comprehend that this is your experience. So instinctually, you want to call out that experience to be like, that doesn't match my lived experience, therefore it cannot be true. Because I think that we don't realize that two things can be true. That, you don't have to have the most delayed gastric emptying in order to qualify as a gastroparesis patient. We all know that we've had multiple emptying scans. Some days they're normal, some days they're not. Some days you throw out food from 4 days ago, and some days you don't throw out for months, and your stomach is slow, but it's moving, right? Like, we've all had those different experiences at different times of the year as we go on with our diseases, and it doesn't make one or the other any less true just because you're now experiencing something different. And I think instinctually we want to disprove somebody else's lived experience, or even our own, honestly, because we're now experiencing something different. And it's just such an interesting, like, off topic but still on topic conversation to have, where you're like, why do I do that? Why do we do that? So Thank you for all the thoughts and journal entries that I'm going to have to make after this for myself.
Yeah, no, I think it's all, on topic just in this area
Different
that
way.
we're talking about of, how we think about this condition, think about ourselves, as someone who has this condition, think about our symptoms, think about what it means. I mean, all of this stuff influences our symptoms, our quality of life, our complete experience of living with gastroparesis. And, honestly, I was on another podcast just a few months ago, and I was like, I think I'm wrapping up my career with gastroparesis. Like, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've been talking about the same stuff, and I just don't feel like I have anything fresh to say. It's funny because then I decided I did need to rewrite the book, before I kind of did that. And in doing this, the research and finding that the stuff that I love to talk about, which is the stuff, you and I have been talking about for the last 45 minutes, this is where my passion is now. It's no longer in, a gastroparesis friendly diet or, that stuff is still important, but like, that's not what I'm passionate about anymore. What I'm passionate about is this stuff. And I didn't really see a super welcoming place for that, to be totally honest. And that's what kind of led me to be like, I think I'm wrapping up here, because I didn't feel like there was a space for me to talk about the things that felt most important to me. And then when I came across this research and was like, okay, here it is in black and white. Like, this isn't just my experience. This isn't just my opinion from, the people I've been working with for over a decade. It's in black and white that this is a significant piece of living with this condition that is not being addressed anywhere else. It was like, whoosh, okay, I am back. I am all in. Like, we need to have these conversations because there is so much more, I think, available to people that we just aren't talking about and don't know to look at. And the doctors, that's not their job. That's not their role. The researchers are identifying that as a piece, which is amazing. But that's not where these conversations are going to happen.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine having this type of conversation, like just walking into like my GI office and having this conversation. And it's not to say that like she wouldn't try to have the conversation, but again, that's not what she's here for. Exactly. That's not what I go to her for. So as we, look at this and we're identifying this and having these conversations, I think that it will start to, at least I would hope, like snowball in the right direction to say that more people are identifying it. More people are like you saying, we need to have more of these conversations. Where does this fit in? How can we fit this into like the generic, even just chronic illness treatment, somebody who's diagnosed with something, but especially in the gastroparesis world where we've been limited for so long on so many things. How can we put this together in a more comprehensive treatment? And I know for me, with conversations that I've had with people in the last year, like you and some other doctors and other, I'll say like pioneers and advocates in the space, are having similar mindsets where it's not quite as dynamic, I'll say, as yours, where I feel like they've had the time to really dig into it, whether, personally or as research, but you're starting to see it. You're starting to see doctors in the space of recognizing, like, this is something we need to talk to. This is something we need to bring to light. How do we do this? But I think they're limited because this isn't their lane. But it's really great to see that they're recognizing that there is a space for this in treatment plans for patients, and that's how we can help get people better in a holistic way, where you're not just ignoring the mind, you're not ignoring the trials and tribulations that people deal with who are going through these treatments or going through these diagnoses and not really having that supportive element. Like, they're starting to see that we need to support that too, which is great. And so I'm glad we can have these conversations. So thank you so much for all of this, and my therapist will thank you as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for being willing to have these, less common conversations. I think it's so important.
Yeah, that was some of my goal here is in starting the podcast, is to have the conversations that no one else is having, because like we said, and what drove my desire to do this was I felt lost in the space because there was no like content or like seat for me at the table anymore. I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere. And I think with a lot of what you're talking about is why I felt like I wasn't fitting in, because they're just, what I needed wasn't available. You know, it's not things that are talking about. So as we have these hard truths, as we have these conversations, to open them up and start to say, this is important, we need to do more of this. And there's a lot of different conversations, some very particular to gastroparesis and living with it, some just chronic illness that we still want to dig into. But I'm just really glad that we are able to do this, and hopefully, again, someone takes something out of this, whether it's a grounding technique, a conversation, you know, anything. I know I've taken a lot away from this, so I really hope that somebody else does too, because it's really important work. So thank you again.
Thank you.